Now to start the event is our moderator, Ryan James Barr, who is our programs and development coordinator on the Japan America Society team. And he's also a Godzilla aficionado, and he will add some interesting points to our conversation. Ryan, please feel free to begin.
Thank you, Paul. Again, good evening and konbanwa to those of you turning in from the States and where it's the evening, and good morning and ohayou gozaimasu to those tuning in from Japan. As Paul stated, my name is Ryan James Barr, and I am the Program and Development Coordinator here at the Japan America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth. And I have the honor and privilege to moderate this program tonight. This is the third in an unofficial series we've been doing, exploring pop culture in Japan throughout this year. And next, I'm going to let our speakers introduce themselves. As part of this introduction, I'd like each of them to tell us what their favorite Godzilla movie is. No quantifying, just what their favorite is. So we're going to go in alphabetical order by last name. So Stephen, we'll start with you.
Hi, and thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to the JAS, and hello, Bill. It's nice to see you again. My name is Steve Reifel. I'm a film journalist, and I've written about Japanese science fiction and fantasy films now for well over 20 years, first out of a personal interest, and then became part of my professional life as well. I wrote a book about the Godzilla films about 20 years ago, and most recently I co-authored with Ed Gazucheski a book called Ishiro Honda, A Life in Film from Godzilla to Kurosawa, which was published by Wesleyan University Press. My favorite Godzilla movie that's a very difficult question to answer because I love them all to one degree or another, but I cherish the first one because it's, without it, none of this means anything. We wouldn't be here talking about this tonight, especially, given the fact that we're going to be talking about some of the ideas and themes in these films, and it all goes back to the original.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Bill Tsutsui. I grew up with Godzilla in Central Texas. I remember watching my first film on Channel 39 from Houston on a Saturday afternoon in the blue shag carpeting my parents' bedroom. I fell in love that day, and the monster's been with me ever since. I'm now a Japanese historian. I've taught at Kansas. I spent 4 years in Dallas at SMU, where I got to know the Japan America Society really well. I have been in Arkansas since then. This year, I'm a visitor at Harvard University. The answer to that question is, as with Steve, I'm afraid a little bit boring, but it's what I got to say. I love that original movie. The 1954 Gojira is a classic. The word classic is thrown around far too much in the movie business, but I think that really is. That has had such a broad influence within cinema and beyond that it justifies the label. I just want to say thank you to Paul, to Ryan at the Japan America Society, and it's such an honor to be on the program tonight with Steve, who really has done some marvelous work on the series over the years.
Well, thank you both. I know I speak for myself and the rest of the staff that we're excited to have you guys tonight. So let's get into it. The title for tonight's program is Godzilla's Enduring Popularity. And while that is a very succinct kind of title, it does convey a very powerful message, and there's a lot of information that's conveyed in a very simple title. This year marks the 66th anniversary of Godzilla, and he has lasted as a character and as a franchise that has seen now 3 imperial rules, several prime ministers, and a Japan that has changed economically a lot in those intervening decades. Godzilla is still with us, though, and is still a fixture of not only Japanese pop culture, but pop culture around the world. Even as newer franchises and characters have come to dominate the global pop culture landscape that Japan is a leader of, we still see Godzilla always at the forefront. So I want to start with the most obvious question. We're going to start, Bill, with you. From an academic's perspective, what makes Godzilla so popular?
It's a great question, and there's no simple answer to that, of course. When I wrote my book, Godzilla on My Mind, that came out in 2004 for the 50th anniversary of the series. Part of what I did was do a survey of Godzilla fans around the country, and I got dozens of responses from people, very long letters in many cases about this lifetime love affair people have with the monster. And it's funny, you know, one of the most popular responses was they like the fact that Godzilla is strong, Godzilla fights for what he believes in, and Godzilla's a hero. It's as simple as that. There's something classic, timeless, and universal about the narrative in these Godzilla movies. And especially the ones that were so popular in America for many of us of my age, at least, growing up. Godzilla fights another monster, saves Japan, and then comes back again and does it in the next film in the franchise. You know, it goes much deeper than that, but on some level, I do think if we want to look at the global popularity of this series, it really is as simple as it is a strong, appealing character, especially to kids.
Thank you, Bill. Steve, same question. What in your mind makes Godzilla so popular?
Well, I think the reason one of the reasons Godzilla has endured, we're talking about his enduring popularity, is that Godzilla has evolved. Godzilla, I think it's well established and worldwide. I think there's a clear understanding now that Godzilla, at least in its origins, came to be as a protest monster. It was a reaction to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and this lingering fear of nuclear war in Japan. And it was also brought about, the first film was very much inspired by a real life event that happened during the year that the film went into production that reignited these fears of nuclear holocaust and of fallout and of this you know, we forget, or sometimes, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't end when the bombs dropped. Those bombs continued to kill for many, many years. The Japanese people suffered, you know, lingering effects in the form of disease and other, you know, trauma that lingered through generations and for many, many years. And so Godzilla is rooted in this pain and in this trauma. And yet over the years, the monster, as Bill said, becomes a hero. It becomes essentially a superhero. It reacts to things going on in Japanese life and culture over the decades. Those are some of the things about the films that I think it's interesting that we don't always appreciate or even understand, being Americans, watching them through the filtration of things like dubbing and editing and, you know, choices that were made on behalf of or by the American distributors that altered the films in pretty significant ways when they were first shown here. So our experience, it's interesting, you know, that Godzilla became so internationally popular because it's rooted in something that's a very Japanese experience, and yet it has this international appeal that speaks to people across cultures and generations. And so it's a really difficult thing to pinpoint, but I think the fact that Godzilla continues to both stay rooted in something that's very recognizable and also evolve. Look where it's kind of come full circle, where we had a film like Shin Godzilla in 2016, where the politics of the film are very different than the original, and yet it's taking Godzilla back to its origins as a monster born of tragedy and of disaster. So I think the fact that Godzilla is both recognizable and doesn't stay the same is really key to its enduring longevity.
Yeah, I often call Godzilla an evergreen monster. It's one of the advantages of being either an actor in a rubber suit or else computer generated special effects, that unlike, you know, sort of Fat Elvis or Pierce Brosnan as 007, you don't have to have, you know, a series change over time on you. That Godzilla changes in a positive way. That Godzilla is always the same and yet always different.
Well, that's a great thing.
I think it's too, we should say, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
Go ahead, Steve. I was
just going to throw in, we should say, I think up front, we're probably going to at some point get into, you know, some of the meaning and subtext of Godzilla. But I think, as Bill was kind of saying, it's totally, everybody comes to Godzilla and learns to love it through their own experience. And, you know, depending on where you were in life when you first saw it, you know, your Godzilla might be the Godzilla of the 1970s when it was this kind of, you know, crazy superhero that, you know, tucked its tail between its legs and flew. Or your Godzilla might be the one from a film like Godzilla versus Monster Zero, where it does a victory dance on on Planet X when it you know defeats King Ghidorah. And there's all these different iterations that have, you know, different personality traits. But the fact that, you know, Godzilla, you know, continues to, like we said, evolve. it really is okay. This is, I guess, what I want to say. It's okay to love these films just because you like watching Godzilla smash cities and fight other monsters. We find deeper meaning in them. You know, those of us who like to parse films out and really, you know, try to figure out what they're telling us, other than, you know, the fact that the monsters are fighting. But it's totally okay just to enjoy the films on that level. These are, in fact, or after all, entertainment films.
Yeah, I think it's great to laugh at these films. I also think I love watching children watch a Godzilla film, because almost, you know, inevitably, as soon as the monsters start fighting, the kids start fighting, you know, and that to me is success. It's like when you hear music that makes you want to move to the beat. The Godzilla films are doing something special.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. So those are great segues about how, I believe, Bill, you said that he is evergreen, that he is changes, but also stays the same. And that has me thinking, you know, the original film was an allegory. It was, as Steve mentioned, it was reactions to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Lucky Seven Dragon incident, as well as, you know, as most movies of the 50s are, they're people working out their trauma of the World War, the Cold War, things like that, on either side of the Pacific. So that kind of makes me want to ask, in modern times, is Godzilla still an allegory? Is there still allegories in those films, or are they more now pure entertainment? And Bill, we'll go with you, and then
Sure. I really want to hear Steve speak on this, because he's written some wonderful things about the politics of recent Godzilla movies. You know, the beauty of Godzilla, right, is Godzilla is a free-floating metaphor. Godzilla can represent the establishment, or Godzilla can be anti-establishment. Godzilla can be Japanese, or Godzilla can be an alien, can be a hero, can be a villain, you know, and that's one of the wonderful things that filmmakers who approach a Godzilla movie have at their disposal. They have a lot of latitude, but it also gives them a lot of rope to make mistakes as well. I think there's some Godzilla movies that have gone astray, perhaps because there's too much latitude in that creature. To me, the best Godzilla movies are the ones that do make a statement, where Godzilla means something more, and that really leave you from the theaters not just having had a wonderful entertainment experience, but thinking about what you saw, and thinking about how it relates to the world at the time we live, and then to larger issues of existence in life.
Yeah, exactly. And so that you can, if you kind of track through the series, and Bill is kind of already stating this, some of the films mean more than others. They have more to say about, you know, what's going on in Japan and in the world than others. Certainly, the first film is the root of all of that. But director Honda always tried, within the context of making a commercial, mass market entertainment film, science fiction film, he always tried, to the best of his ability, to impart a message or make a statement or a comment about things that were happening in the world at that time, and particularly things that he was concerned about. That gradually became more difficult for him, because these films were so popular at the box office that the studio pushed it more and more in the direction of an entertainment franchise. One of the earliest examples of Godzilla moving away from its, maybe a little bit away from its roots as an anti-nuclear monster, but into something else that is, you know, was equally concerning to Honda, was King Kong versus Godzilla. And I know Bill has also written pretty extensively about this, but King Kong versus Godzilla is a hybrid of a giant monster movie, a kaiju eiga, Japanese giant monster movie. And it's very much, it has a lot in common with other genres of Japanese commercial films at that time. There's elements of salaryman comedy, but it's really a corporate satire is what it is. And in particular, it was a satire of the popularity of television programming that Honda saw as really, really, you know, trivial and banal. Japanese television broadcasting started in the early 50s, around 53, 54. And in the first few years of that, largely there wasn't much original programming. So a lot of American programs were imported for broadcast on Japanese television. And then when Japanese original programming started to flourish, a lot of it originally was there were a lot of programs that were essentially like candid camera type prank programs that were really kind of stupid in Honda's view. And so, and then another thing that was really common and was really popular was pro wrestling. We had people like Freddie Blassie going over to Japan, and American pro wrestlers faced off against Japanese pro wrestlers, and this was, you know, on live television a lot of the time. So the film is really a comment on what Honda saw as really stupid television. And I know, Bill, if you want to comment on this, because you went into a lot of detail in your book on that as well.
You know, I think one thing I want to say about Godzilla as an allegory through the series is Godzilla is often there to make us deal with a problem we can't ignore, but we try to ignore, you know? And so this to me is one of the constant themes in the film. And I think, you know, when you talk about King Kong versus Godzilla in the 60s, that's right on. You know, Japanese people at the time were implicit in that sort of commercialization of society that was taking place at the time. But Honda really wanted to confront them, to think about that and have fun with it, of course. The satire is very funny at some points in that movie, but it can also be very biting as well. I expect that was lost on a lot of the 8-year-olds who went to see the film. But the beauty of the movies is 8-year-olds have plenty to watch there, and adults do as well.
Right, and for a good number of years, the films had both the parents and the kids in mind, and gradually it shifted more to the younger audience because they were the ones dragging the parents to go see it. By the mid '60s and into the late '60s, early '70s, they were making films more explicitly for kids, with children in the driver's seat in the main you know, roles of the film. But even there, you can see that Honda is the primary director that I think is more conscious of using the films in a way to speak about other things, whereas some of the other directors in the series, while equally skilled, kind of went for more of a straight ahead science fiction or action movie. But if you're familiar with the film, it's known by various names. It used to be known as Godzilla's Revenge. Now it tends to be called All Monsters Attack. But that's a film very much about this trade-off of the post-war economic miracle where everybody had a job and an apartment, and you know, and there was, you know, a lot more opportunity to, you know, share in the prosperity. But a lot of people, you know, had two income households now, and the kids were alone a lot. So it's very much about a boy who dreams of hanging out with Godzilla's son because there's no parent in the house, and he's bullied a lot. He's just, you know, a small fry. So that's a wonderful film that uses that form, and that's actually a very unique film in this whole series. It's actually a meta kaiju film because it's the first film in the series that acknowledges that these monsters are imaginary, they're not real. Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, which is great. It acknowledged a universal problem, was made right after the first Earth Day, and smog, of course, was very much on the minds of Americans. The EPA had just been formed in the United States, but it really actually was tied to a series of incidents in Japan where there was chemical dumping into waterways, and people were suffering from all kinds of horrible health conditions because of that. And the smog monster is kind of I don't know, an outgrowth or the result of very specific pollution and industrial waste problems that were happening in Japan, and were very recognizable.
Yeah, with that movie, I always think of the scene. For those who haven't seen it, the smog monster looks exactly as you imagine. It's a pile of sludge with eyes that flies, and there's that very graphic scene where he's flying over the city and people are just turning into skeletons.
Oh yeah.
I always, you know, seeing that at 10 years old, 12 years old on Sci-Fi Channel, you're like, wow, that's dark even for a Godzilla movie.
It's a bizarre movie. It was shown. That's the first one I saw as a child, not on television. I was watching, but that actually played in Los Angeles as a children's matinee. It's a children's matinee with people being burned alive with, you know, acidic sludge and turned into skeletons.
Yeah. So you guys both discussed how it, you know, Godzilla can reflect contemporary issues going on in Japan, as media often will reflect country of origin, what's going on, those discussions, satire. This is going to be two things. One, one, when it comes to satire and or talking about contemporary issues, when it's brought to the West, because obviously there is a localization process of any media from Japan to the U.S. or the West as a whole. Is any of that ever lost? And then, so that's one question. And the second question, kind of jumping point from that, is the satire in Shin Godzilla, the latest movie in the series. I think, in my opinion, and I think this would be a great discussion point, to me, that is the most obvious of satire and kind of pointing to the breakdown of bureaucratic systems and the breakdown of governments when you have the governor of Tokyo and the prime minister pointing fingers at each other of whose problem is this Godzilla thing to solve, which we see later in real life. We you know, COVID-19, Fukushima, incidents here in the United States and other countries that we see that where the powers that be are not sure who's really in charge. So first, the satire being brought to the what is lost when things are brought to the West, and then that. So Steve, I would love to hear for you to go first on what is lost when it's brought to the West.
Well, it's not just if there's a satirical element in the film, that's not the only thing that would be, I think, lost. We've heard the term cultural interference patterns, but in terms of these films, what it basically means is some of the things I was talking about earlier. First of all, back in the day, we're living, if you're a Godzilla fan, you're kind of in this Renaissance period now where you can get any of the Godzilla films basically in its original uncut, letterboxed, full aspect ratio in the original language. But back in the day when these films were first imported, think about it, it was, when the first Godzilla film was brought to the United States in 1956. And it set a pattern going forward. One of the reasons that they were able to distribute it as widely as they could is because of the way that they altered the film. And back in those days, I don't know if you would have had much commercial success, 11 years after the end of World War II, distributing an all Japanese cast film with subtitles. So what they did rather ingeniously, although some people take great issue with it, is they disguised the movie as an American production. In fact, some of the marketing materials lied about it and said the film was shot by Americans in Tokyo. But they took Raymond Burr, who was before Perry Mason, but he was still a credible character actor, and they shot reversals with him interacting with Ishiro Honda's cast, and they somehow inserted him into the picture and made it, if not seamless, it's acceptable. If you're not, in those days, you didn't have the option of watching the film over and over and over again at home and picking apart the little things that don't, quite work. But now, we can do that. But the film was a huge success, and it set in motion both it established the Godzilla brand name, at least in its infancy in the United States, and it also set the pattern for going forward of American distributors acquiring these films and then changing them quite a bit. And so when you dub a film, you lose the original actor's performance, and you overdub that person with a different voice, which doesn't match the lip movements and creates this sense of comedy. We've come to laugh at that. It's sort of reflexive, and also there were other changes made, like changing the music, changing the title of the film, cutting the film, removing scenes, or sometimes things were moved around. We talked about King Kong versus Godzilla. They tried to turn it into this War of the Worlds news broadcast kind of thing, which all it served to do was slow the film down. Like every time something starts happening, it stops. But then again, the film was a huge success in the United States as well for a movie of that type. So fast forward all these years, and Shin Godzilla gets a limited theatrical run in the United States, but we're seeing it in its original language for the most part. And even though Japanese bureaucratic politics aren't really the stuff that, Japanese politics are not like front page news in the United States very often. And I don't think people really appreciate but you can get the satire nonetheless, even if you're not familiar with the massive bureaucracy of Japan. I think what's interesting too, those kind of meetings, one of the things in that film is that they go from meeting to meeting to meeting, they have a meeting about how to have another meeting. It's really comical. But go back 50 years to Honda's films, and those were the kind of meetings that they would have to kind of decide these things, and nobody ever questioned it because it's a very culturally established thing to do.
Ryan, going back to your original question, I think, in Godzilla coming across the Pacific, there was a lot lost in translation. Some was intentional and some was unintentional, right? There's some references in those movies that only Japanese people can understand, know? And I think, honestly, in a way, a question we have to ask ourselves is, can we as Americans ever understand the original 1954 Gojira like Japanese at the time understood it less than 10 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I honestly don't think we can. We can, try as hard as we can. And yet, that really was a gut punch to people watching the film at the time. There's nothing Hollywood could have done about that when they brought, the film across the Pacific. There's nothing we can do today. That being said, I think as Steve described wonderfully, a lot of people, when they think about those classic Godzilla movies from the 60s and 70s, they think of the, Technicolor, sort of cheesy special effects, the dubbing, and so forth. One has to realize how much of that was fabricated in Godzilla's transit across the Pacific. In many ways, these began as much more coherent, polished movies than they ended up when we watched them. We can now appreciate that because we can see subtitled versions of as close to the original cut as we can get. But at the time, and this is why so many people, when they look back at Godzilla, they smile and laugh as their first reaction. At the time, Hollywood thought the way to sell these was to make them funny, and to, let the people who were doing the dubbing make up the lines as they went along. And consequently, a lot of them were not real great.
Yeah. Those are all great points. I mean, I think the reputation that these films acquired when they came across the Pacific is largely due to the way they were marketed, and that marketing translated into this really dismissive attitude on the part of reviewers, if these films were ever reviewed, but often they were in some of the major newspapers. We tend to, I don't know if racism is the right word, but there was, definitely, as we said, it's only a decade or so after the end of the war when these films came over, and there probably was some of that going on as well when people reacted to these films. But by and large, this reputation of these films being quote unquote cheap is something that was both I think a cultural reaction and as Bill said, a manufactured response. If you were to have had the experience of watching these films in Japan at the time, now none of this would have been known, I think, to the general audience in the 1950s and 60s, but Japan and Japanese cinema was undergoing this massive renaissance in the 50s and early 60s. In fact, for a short time, the Japanese movie industry was the most productive in the world in terms of output. And I'm not just talking about the art house films from Kurosawa and other, major directors that were playing in the film festival circuits around the world and in art house theaters here. There was a major commercial Japanese movie industry of which Toho was one of the powerhouses. And the people you see in Godzilla movies were not B-movie actors. Those were big stars at Toho Studios. They were people who were, really, really popular and famous. And that's something that is, I think, maybe now there's a little bit of appreciation for that now that some of these films are part of the Criterion collection, but that was totally lost. These were not, B-movie actors or anything like that. These were major productions at the time in Japan, and I think that's one aspect by the way that they were, repackaged, treated, and dismissed here that was completely lost. Good point.
I think that's a great point about the repackaging. I know we mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think King Kong vs. Godzilla is probably the worst offender of that.
Oh, sure.
If you watch the American dub, scenes are taken out. It's almost, the plot is completely incoherent in the American dub. I recently actually had the opportunity to watch the original Japanese with subtitles, the plot actually makes sense, and there's a flow even with the subtitles, which sometimes, again, things get lost a little bit with subtitles, but even then, I was watching it, and now in my 30s, first time I watched it, I was 11 years old, and I was like, oh, so that's what's going on. It was kind of there is that point where until the monsters are fighting each other, you have no idea kind of who's who and what's going on in the American dub, but in the original Japanese, like, oh, this is a fully coherent, a fully realized, polished movie.
That film just reeks of the attitude that the American distributors had towards this content that they were acquiring, and they were acquiring it on the cheap for many years. The first Godzilla film, the U.S. and I think North American rights to it were acquired for something like $25,000, and then that group of people made a ton of money selling the Raymond Burr version all over parts of the world. But King Kong versus Godzilla, they filmed these really cheap inserts with actors who were not terribly well known, but the newsroom looks like it takes place in somebody's garage, and they have a map of the world. I haven't seen it in a couple, but the map of the world looks like they bought it at a gas station or something, and and it has the folds like you have one of the you remember the old AAA maps, and then they just hung it up with push pins, so they really went all out.
Another thing that comes to mind, not to get deep into the marketing or how these films were brought to the U.S. Another thing that comes to mind is, I believe it's Godzilla versus Megalon, where the American poster, they're fighting on top of the World Trade Center, and that movie never takes place in New York. There's no World Trade Center. It takes place, really in the countryside of Japan. It's, I think there's, if you start looking at it, you start seeing not outright racism, but definitely a prejudicial view of.
Well, that was genius, though. That came out right around the time that the De Laurentiis King Kong came out, which had the poster of King Kong atop the Trade Center. So they were really, riffing on that and trying to. They were deceiving the public, no doubt. But I find it kind of interesting and clever.
Yeah. So looking at today now, we and I think we touched upon this. Godzilla has been allegory, he's been hero, he's been villain. And obviously he's still popular. Obviously he still exists in as a franchise. But in Japan currently, how is he viewed? I think in the United States, as you both mentioned, there's kind of a renaissance of Godzilla. There's kind of this whole he's been hero all this time, and these are actually really good movies, and I think the Criterion Collection has helped a lot. I think Kurosawa in the last 60 years has become, it's Ford, Kurosawa. There's like some major, those directors that are the directors for the West. How is Godzilla viewed today in Japan? Bill, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah. So for a very long time, Japanese were very confused by how obsessed Americans were with Godzilla. They just didn't get it, A lot of people would recognize Godzilla and the movies, but they did not understand why in America people were such diehard fans and why they associated Godzilla with Japan so strongly. For many Japanese people, Godzilla was something that sort of otaku, that sort of obsessive fans were into. It was very much a subcultural activity. And for most of them, they grew up much more addicted to Ultraman because that was on TV every week and sort of came into their homes in a much more active way than they ever were in Godzilla. I think there has been a change in Japan. Part of that is what we've been talking about here, that Godzilla films in general are being taken more seriously. A number of Japanese critics have listed, the original Godzilla among the top 10, top 50 Japanese movies ever made. And the respect they've gotten and the fact that Hollywood has gone back to the series now for a second time to work it, that has gotten it more attention in Japan.
And I think there's been some, and I totally agree with that. When I first went to Japan to start doing research on these films in the 1990s, the average people would kind of look at you a little strange, like, well, why are you so, interested in this, and there was not, a great deal of Godzilla paraphernalia around. You'd see things occasionally, but now, I mean, there's a hotel in Shinjuku with Godzilla's head sticking out of it. There are Godzilla, theme park attractions, and there have been, not to say that there never were before, but now they're, super prominent, and they're highly visible. So I think there's been maybe, of course, Godzilla's also generational, and I think as new generations grow up and get involved in marketing and these things, it becomes more prominent again. It goes through cycles. But right now we're seeing, it's really interesting that all this stuff has kind of popped up. I think largely there must be some impetus. It's concurrent with the legendary franchise, the American, licensing of Godzilla and these big budget, $200, $300 million Godzilla movies that are coming out of Hollywood now. But in Japan, those films don't seem to be, from what I can tell, super popular. And a lot of these, like the hotel we were talking about, those things are coming out of a period when Godzilla was absent from the screen for many years before Shin Godzilla. There wasn't a Japanese live action Godzilla movie between 2004 was Final Wars, 2016. So that's what, a 12-year period. I'm not very good at math, sorry. So it really, I think we're in a period there now where there's much more consciousness of it, and it's much more visible. But you quickly learn if you go to Japan on any kind of quest like this, that Japanese pop culture, as if you didn't know already, it's a mammoth thing, and Godzilla is just, Godzilla was at the front end of it, and it certainly opened these pathways for things like anime to come over to the United States. But at the same time, it's now just part of this giant, universe of Japanese pop culture that's so influential all over the world.
Right. So final question for you both real quickly, and then we'll get into audience questions. So Godzilla has tackled nuclear issues, environmental issues, other contemporary issues. If Toho was to make a movie starting obviously next year or beyond, how do you think Godzilla and Toho is going to tackle COVID-19?
Yeah.
Either one of you can answer that.
Steve, go ahead.
I have no idea. Godzilla is a brand. It's more than a film franchise, so it's going to be around for the foreseeable future. It's also, Toho, once having been this mammoth movie studio, is now a company that's much more focused, and this is really like their big property that they're going to maintain and nurture. I think that I don't know how Godzilla is going to handle COVID. I hope he does, because we need his help right now. But it definitely, one of the things that we've seen, and I'll kind of close with this, in recent years, is that after this long, Godzilla evolved, but there was always this formula, this recognizable formula that usually ends with Godzilla fighting one or more monsters at the end of the film. Now they've done different things with that, but that's generally how it works. With things like Shin Godzilla, or the anime trilogy that was distributed here through Netflix, and now there's a new animation series coming out, I guess next year, called Singular Point, Godzilla Singular Point. But Toho is showing an openness to working with filmmakers and giving them creative latitude to take the basic idea and concept of Godzilla and do different things with it, and be more creative, and say things that they want to say with it. So I'd be really open to that if they were to hopefully continue to allow filmmakers that kind of freedom and creativity. And I would love to see what they could do with COVID.
Yeah, I too am really curious about that. I hope they do better with COVID than Godzilla King of the Monsters, the most recent one, did with climate change, which I thought they fumbled on that one. It's neat because the original Godzilla, of course, represented the fear of something that is invisible, radioactivity. And now we're dealing with something else that's invisible. I would really love it if the way they dealt with this movie was to show how sometimes crisis does not lead to a society coming together and sort of joining hands to fight a common foe, but can lead to discord, to debate, and to polarization, as we've seen in this crisis in the United States and increasingly around the world as well. Some of the Godzilla movies do explore that. There's a lot of conflict in the 1954 Gojira. In Shin Godzilla 2, we see that coming to the fore. And I think those are very successful. And I would love to see a movie that addresses Godzilla deniers in society who don't believe the monster's actually out there.
That's a great idea.
That'd be good. I'd like that. So we have some questions from the audience, and this is a great one. I think is very poignant. Obviously, Godzilla, he's popular both in the America and Japan. But how is he viewed in other parts of East Asia? What does his international legacy look like outside of the two countries that we've been discussing? Either one. Bill, maybe you have an academic answer for this.
Yeah, sure. I think, Godzilla truly is a global star. So, he's played in every country, every continent, you name it. There has been a Godzilla franchise made an appearance there. I have not seen quite the level of fanaticism about the series in other parts of Asia that I have seen in North America and South America, frankly. I've talked to a lot of people who grew up in South America, Mexico and, South America, and have, grew up with those movies as well. Of course, there are significant Japanese populations through lots of Latin America. And so that might have something to do with it as well. But clearly there are a lot of fans there, and clearly the films that are being made today, both in Japan and in the United States, are looking to the Chinese market as a way of generating revenue.
Yeah, one interesting aspect of that, Japan, of course, occupied much of Asia for many years. And there was a certain backlash to that in certain parts of Asia. After the war, in Korea in particular, Japanese content was banned for many years. And in 1967, there was a giant monster film made in South Korea called Yongari. And it was highly influenced by the Godzilla series. And in fact, the filmmakers partnered with Toei Studios, which is a rival of Toho, to bring over Japanese special effects technicians to help with things like building the miniature sets and making the monster suit. It's very much done in the style of a Godzilla movie. And it's interesting because at that point, none of the Godzilla movies could be officially distributed in South Korea. It was during the regime of Park Chung-hee, and Japanese content, including things like magazines and manga and all that, was still banned. So they made this film for the filmmaker knew that these films were immensely popular in Japan. It's not clear, but I think he might have traveled there and seen some of them, and he just knew it would click with an audience. It was one of the biggest commercial hits of that year, even though there was really no precedent for it, which I find entirely fascinating. Yongari,
yep. Just such a wonderful picture. I encourage people to watch it. I don't want to give the spoiler here, but he sort of dies from itching powder.
That's true.
And there's a wonderful thing where there are these people in a helicopter watching him suffer and die. And they're sort of like munching popcorn as they're observing this happen.
It's horrible.
It's amazing.
It's really suffering. Another thing about that film, the Japanese occupation of Korea is I guess much on people's minds for many years after the end of the war. There's a scene in the movie that looks like, I remember, I did some research on this film, and I was talking to a South Korean writer colleague who's familiar with the production. There's a scene where Yongari, the monster, tramples through a building, and it looks very similar to the scene in the first Godzilla where Godzilla walks through the Diet Building. In fact, the building that Yongari destroys looks a bit like the Diet Building. And I asked my colleague, is this a tribute to that scene? And he said, well, not exactly, that building is representative of the Japanese seat of government during the Japanese occupation, because they built a bunch of Japanese-style architecture buildings. So, and the Yongari is essentially destroying the Japanese seat of power. So it's a little bit of a protest there. Yeah. So yeah, that's just one example. And then Yongari became very popular and they ended up remaking it some 20 or so years later. And the Godzilla movies are quite popular now in South Korea, although many of them were not actually distributed there officially until, I don't know, sometime into the 80s or 90s.
Yeah. I remember when the ban was lifted, and it was a big deal. So here's another audience question that I think is interesting. Definitely, at least from a thought experiment. So currently we have kind of two. I don't want to say two continuities, but there are two franchises for Godzilla running parallel. There is the Toho movies. There's also the MonsterVerse movies that Warner Brothers and Legendary is creating. How do you think these two might shape each other moving forward?
Well, and never the twain shall meet. The interesting, so the Toho, the legendary MonsterVerse is very much an attempt to do something like what the MCU is doing, and they're trying to establish continuity between the films. That's not something that the Toho films were always so concerned about. There was loose continuity between the films, and they might reference events from one to the other, but all of a sudden it might jump forward in time, by a couple of decades. Destroy All Monsters takes place well after the previous films in the series, example like that. So, continuity, someone asked me, what's canon in the Godzilla, the Toho verse, and I don't know all of it, and none of it, because, the reality shifts from one movie to another sometimes. And some of them have, they exist in like an alternate timeline and all that. So certainly the MonsterVerse is trying to take the basics of Godzilla and use that as the framework for their own monster. One of the things that I took a little bit of an issue with is in the 2014 film. Now, Toho, I believe, still has a Bible that I know that they presented this document to Roland Emmerich when he made his Godzilla film. I assume they had something similar for Gareth Edwards and Legendary when they relaunched when they rebooted Godzilla. And there are things about Godzilla's appearance and about its origins that I guess the filmmakers have to adhere to. One of them being that Godzilla is, I believe, being that Godzilla is the result, or its birth is the result of a nuclear explosion or accident. In that 2014 film, they kind of twisted the events around the Castle Bravo nuclear test that gave rise to the Lucky Dragon tragedy. And turned it around so that explosion was part of some secret operation to kill Godzilla. Now, I just find that a little bit, nobody else I don't think has objected to it, but I think you're playing with history there in a way that you don't really need to. And I'm sure the screenwriter thought he was being very clever when he came up with that, but I think that's disrespectful to the original and its intent. There's a great deal, if you talk about influence, in the 2019 Godzilla film, Godzilla King of the Monsters. There's a great deal of fan service in that film. There are references galore to the original series and all of the Toho series of films, to the point where during the final battle there are riffs during the monster fight that are taken straight out of other films that you've seen before. They're done maybe technically in a more sophisticated way, but that felt a little, I don't know, it just felt a little too familiar, but I can see why they do it.
Steve hit one of my real gripes with the Hollywood Godzillas, and that is the change in the origin story.
Sure.
As you may remember from the TriStar one as well. Again, the blame is shifted from the United States. It's French nuclear testing in Polynesia that gets the monster going. So it just is still, even decades after the atomic bombs, we just cannot get our minds around the idea that perhaps this had really horrible consequences that we need to deal with still. My other big gripe story is this tendency in the legendary films and in all of the American films to really stress the biological drive of the monster, that the monster has to be sort of credible in a organismic sense, that there's some kind of genetic programming that motivates what it does. What I love about a lot of the Godzilla movies from Japan is, there's not a clear logic about why the monster does something. Why after being irradiated by the Castle Bravo test does Godzilla attack Tokyo? Who knows?
Right.
I don't think I need to know that, but I know that there is some kind of consciousness on the part of the monster that is driving it to do that. And I think that's the beauty of the Toho series. It's been lost a bit in its translation.
I totally agree. You're touching on something that's very elemental to the origin of Godzilla. We've talked about the Lucky Dragon and the hydrogen bomb test, but if you recall, in Honda's original story, there are actually two parallel origins that are kind of hinted at. One of them being that Godzilla is a god that was, revered by the people of Odo Island for generations. And so when Godzilla appears, they know, they don't have any question as to what it is. It's this, this being that they've been fearing for many generations. Whereas Dr. Yamane's theory is a theory. It's a plausible theory, but he doesn't have like all undisputable data or anything like that. It's just the most plausible theory for what happened. And so yeah, you're right, and that's a tradition that goes back to American science fiction, from years past, where that was the whole point, was to explain what's happening. But yeah, it can really kind of take some of the imagination out of the story.
Yeah, removing the origin of Godzilla is kind of like removing the origin of Batman. If his parents are not killed, then there is no Batman. It's very similar in that vein. Final audience question for the evening, and I really like this one because it's actually mentioned one of my favorite in the series. So there's a lot of love for the Showa series, and there's a lot of out the Criterion Collection, and there's a lot of film historians and film writers that are all about the Showa series and looking at it in retrospect. But rarely is anything from the 21st century or even from the 90s discussed. Rarely do you ever see anything from the Millennium or the Shinsei series discussed, especially Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah of 2004.
Yeah. That's one of the most interesting films in the entire series. It didn't receive any kind of a theatrical distribution here, so it's limited by the fact that it's only really been seen in home video and streaming. And I don't know if it has played in any, it probably played at the Fantasia Film Festival. I'm not sure about that. I assume it probably did. My memory escapes me, but that's a wonderful film that deals with some real serious concerns about Japan's role, geopolitical role in this changing world. There's this tension. Japan has undergone this transformation after the war, politically, culturally, economically, and militarily. And right now, over the past, say, 20 years, roughly, there's been this increasing tension between Japan's, post-war identity as a peaceful, non-militaristic nation, and the increasing threats that it is dealing with in terms of North Korea firing missiles over Japan, or tensions with China in the South China Sea over the possession of the islands. So, and there's also been this lingering question about America's role in defending Japan and what will happen there. And GMK is really about, in relation to that, this attitude that director Shusuke Kaneko perceived among certain people about having lost touch with memories of the war, that the national memory of the war, and maybe having faded a bit, and that trauma that we were discussing maybe having faded so far into the rearview mirror that we're losing sight of the fact that we may be returning to part of the past that's very dark and dangerous. And that's what, so Godzilla is, meant to represent something really powerful, and that it's this, this embodiment of the spirits of not only the Japanese soldiers killed in the Pacific War, but basically everybody killed in the Pacific War. It's a vengeful spirit.
Right.
Yeah, GMK is a great film, but I agree with you. There are a lot of those films from that era that don't get the love that they should. Personally, one of my favorites is Godzilla versus King Ghidorah from 1991. A lot to work on in that film. Probably has one of my favorite scenes in any of the Godzilla films, where Godzilla meets his old friend from the island in the South Pacific decades later, when he's become a titan of Japanese industry and is on the penthouse of his skyscraper, and there's this look in Godzilla's eyes, and you don't know if Godzilla is remembering, is having a fond memory, is has affection for this man, but then he just looks straight at him and blasts him with his radiation beam, and it is marvelous. It is just everything you want from that series.
I wonder with those series, because we, in King Kong or Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, you have the Japanese soldiers being saved by the Godzillasaurus that becomes Godzilla. In GNK, you have the spirits of all the dead from the war coming back. I wonder, just as we discussed earlier, and I'll kind of leave this as a food for thought thing, I wonder if, just as we don't like maybe in the West discussing the atomic bomb and and things, culpability, perhaps those movies from the 90s and early aughts are maybe a little too nationalistic or maybe too jingoistic for an American audience to digest. And I'll leave it there.
Well, there's certainly a greater emphasis on military characters from the military in those films.
Yeah.
There's a shift away from, in Honda's films, the main usually was like a trio of main characters that would usually involve like a scientist and a reporter and maybe somebody else. But yeah, by the early aughts, those films generally shift toward characters in the military, although kind of underdog characters usually.
Right. Well, Bill, Steve, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Ryan.
I think I'm so honored to have both of you joining us, and I'm very glad you got to do so, and I hope the audience enjoyed it as well. I know we didn't get to every audience question. I think we had about 10 or 11 altogether actually brought up, so we will have to get some responses out to those. But again, I want to thank both of you for participating. I want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight, and I believe I'm going to pass it back to Paul.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ryan. And just to echo Ryan's comments as well, thank you to all of our speakers, to our two speakers for their time and their role in helping us learn more about a truly entertaining topic and a global icon. We would also like to express our gratitude to everyone who attended this program and for your eagerness to explore more about Godzilla. We had a lot of great questions, as Ryan mentioned, and if you still have anything that you would like to share with us, or perhaps anything that we could send along to the speakers, please send to info@jasdfw.org. So again, that's info@jasdfw.org. Please also note that this webinar has been recorded, and we plan to upload to YouTube soon, so you can enjoy the program again. At this time, if you could share the slides for upcoming programs, great. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we hope that you can join for some more upcoming events. In a couple of weeks, so mid-December, we will have our annual Bonenkai Forget the Year party, and this will be presented online for the very first time. This year's special presentation features local Dallas YouTuber, Excuse Me Dallas, and an option to pick up food from Ichigo Ramen in Deep Ellum. The program will also include trivia, a raffle, and Zoom breakout rooms to socialize with friends. Next month, and we'll move along to the Mochitsuki program. So next month, we will have our annual Mochitsuki New Year's celebration, which will also be presented online. The event will feature dance performances, a mochi pounding demonstration, a unique video from Hiroshima, and kakizome, the first calligraphy of the new year. We are also finalizing special mochi and activity sets available for purchase, and you would pick those up at our office in Plano. Lastly, we will share information soon about our next Japan Current Symposium. So there's not a slide for this, but we will share some information soon. Our Japan Current Symposium this year will also be, well, I guess it's for 2021. That will be presented online and will be in mid-February. We kindly ask that you complete the post-event survey, which will pop up in your browser once the program ends. If you are unable to access the link, we will also share a post-event email this week. This concludes tonight's program. Thank you for attending, and have a wonderful rest of the evening for our US attendees and a great rest of the day for those in Japan. Thank you so much.